On behalf of Sigma Tau Delta, thank you all for coming to hear from our department chair, Dr. Faustino. And please, on your way out, feel free to help yourself to baked goods. There's brownie bites and chocolate walnut biscotti waiting for you. So please take them with you on your way out. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our Sigma Tau Delta president, Megan McFall-Gorman, who's going to introduce Dr. Faustino.
Thank you all for coming. Now, when first asked to introduce this afternoon's speaker, anyone who was in the room with me could attest to how excited and thrilled I was. But they could also tell you how terrified I was moments afterwards. Having never been asked, let alone been given the honor to introduce someone as academically accomplished as Dr. Faustino, my anxiety was understandable. This individual has written 2 picture books, 4 young adult novels, including The Hole in the Wall, the winner of the 2010 Milkweed Prize. Their essay on anthropomorphism in picture books won this year's prize for Best Article from Children's Literature Association, and she has just released another essay collection, Mothers in Children's and Young Adult Literature, which is the express reason why we are all here today. However, most of you know our speaker as the chair of the English department, or, for those of you lucky enough to have had her, a professor. Yet, I believe that my purpose here today is not just to list accomplishments, though they are very extensive, but rather to give you, to the best of my ability, a glimpse at how I really got to know Dr. Faustino. This past fall was the first time I ever took a class with Dr. Faustino. It was her young adolescent novel course, and at the time I was an education major and it was a requirement, but then I wasn't an education major and I didn't need the class, yet I still took it because it just engaged all the students. It was an exceptional course and it really grew on me. And at the end of the year, I even decided to do my final paper as a young adolescent novel and do excerpts of my own harebrained scheme. And Dr. Faustino saw something in that and asked me to continue it with an independent study the following semester, writing for publishing. And it was by means of that experience that I truly got to see Dr. Faustino for who she really is. A kind, lighthearted, warm, wonderfully mischievous, witty, endearing, and brilliant, genuine person. And there are far too many people like her in the world, so... Far too few. Oh my gosh, no. Everything was going so well. There aren't too many people like you, Dr. Faustino, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to present today's speaker, Dr. Lisa Faustino.
That's the best introduction I ever had anywhere. Thank you, Megan. Wow. So thank you, Sigma Tau Delta, for inviting me here today to talk about my latest book, Mothers in Children's and Young Adult Literature from the 18th Century to Post-Feminism, which I co-edited with my colleague at Illinois State University, Karen Coates. It has 13 essays in it, all around the theme of mothering in children's and young adult literature from a variety of perspectives, critical lenses, etc. And I'm very proud of it. It's the product of many, many years of work. In my talk today, I'm going to answer some questions that you sent me from Sigma Tau Delta. I'll divide the time into 2 parts. First, I'll answer some general questions that you gave me about the book and my writing. And then second, I'll go to more specific questions about the concepts in the introduction and in the chapter that I contributed to the book that many of you read, I believe. Anytime along the way, I welcome you guys to jump in and make a comment or ask another question. Don't be shy about that. So, starting out with the general questions. The first one that I received was, what experiences sparked your interest to write about the topic of mothers in literature? And it's a pretty long story. I won't tell you everything, but I'll tell you that there are 4 things. The very first one was becoming a mother myself. I had my first child when I was 21 years old. I turned 22 2 weeks after I had her. And reading picture books to your children from the perspective of being a mother now changes you a lot about how you read books. So when I started reading books like The Giving Tree, or love you forever, or the runaway bunny to my children, no longer from the subject position of being a child myself, but from being a mother who was also an academic and a creative writer who had learned to think about things more deeply beneath the surface of things. I started to be, frankly, a bit horrified because as the Giving Tree, I was then getting my arms cut off and my trunk cut down to make a boat for my selfish little son who only wanted to take and never wanted to give and didn't have a reciprocal relationship. And I thought, what the, I can't say the word I thought. This is a bestseller. It's sold over 18 million copies in hardcover, never been put out into paperback because it's so popular and beloved and viewed as this parable of sacrificial love. I don't think so. The Runaway Bunny, a little bit better, but this is kind of on the opposite end, whereas in the Giving Tree, we have this rooted mother who's always there for her son, and that's her whole life until she dies and becomes a stump on the last page. The Runaway Bunny is about a mother who won't let her kid out of her sight. No matter where the kid tries to run away, she's going to chase him down. When I got to the page here, I got to read you the text first. If you become a sailboat and sail away from me, said his mother, I will become the wind and blow you where I want you to go. I thought, oh my God, control freak mother. No, no, get away from that mother. And then another one that was very popular when my kids were babies and growing up, I Love You Forever by Robert Munsch. Is that another one you know? Yeah? This is the one that has the refrain, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. And she sings this to her son when he's a baby, rocking in the arms. Okay, that one makes a little sense. But as he gets older, she still sneaks into his room at night and does it and picks him up when he's a little kid, when he's a teenager. When he's a man and he moves away, she puts a ladder on the top of her car, drives across town, puts the ladder up to his window, crawls in, and sings him the song at night while he's asleep as a grown man. Whew. Anyway, I'm thinking, I want my own life. I don't want to be that mother that has to drive across town and put the ladder up so that I can revert my child to the infancy where I felt value. I'm defined by being a mother, and that's all I am. No, I want to have a reciprocal relationship with my children, and I want us all to be complete, whole, developed, actualized human beings, right? So that's number one. Number two was, in my role as a creative writing teacher, over the years, I started to notice patterns in the manuscripts that my students would submit to me, both in the undergraduate level and in the graduate level, because some of you may know this, I teach in the graduate program in children's literature at Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia, many summers, and I often teach creative writing workshops there. And I would see manuscript after manuscript about the abandoning mother being the conflict for the adolescent protagonist. So it would be a mother who did some selfish thing. She went off to do something for herself, and this became the problem for the child to cope with. And I thought, gee, this is way out of whack. For my mother myself, who's trying, yeah, I'm off at Hollins teaching a class, but I got my kids with me. My kids are having fun. They're rollerblading, and they're getting lasagna made by Morag Stiles from Scotland, who's the most hilarious, fun lady who's teaching a class there too. They had a cool life, right? And I'm not saying that no mother ever abandons her children and abuses and neglects and all that, but it was out of proportion. It was like this thing, this big cultural thing that I would see everywhere. So that was number two. The third, I have to owe it to my feminist theory class. When I was getting my PhD at Binghamton University, I took a feminist theory class. It was an eye-opening, awakening experience for me in 1990, I think it was. About half the class were lesbian separatists. That's a phrase I had never heard of before that class. But I would say it's a kind of radical edge of feminism with women who feel, in the class they articulated this, that all heterosexual sex is violation, and that the best world would be made with lesbian mothers who conceive through parthenogenesis, which is something that rabbits can do, but so far humans haven't been able to figure it out. And they viewed traditional mothering and marriage very skeptically and cynically and critically. And here I was, what was I in 1990? I was 30 maybe. I had 3 kids before the age of 27 myself. And here I was sitting in this group thinking, whew. But it was an eye-opener, and I thought about it, and I figured out where this comes from. But I felt, coming out of a very traditional sort of family in rural Maine where I was raised, very religious. I was taken to church 3 times a week, very traditional kind of patriarchal structure in the family. And then learning about this, I don't want to say the extreme edges of feminism, and being in the middle of it and being feeling very kind of under attack in this setting. I started to think about mothering in ways that were totally divergent from how I had been raised, and started thinking about it from multiple perspectives and trying to respect other views of it. Believe it or not, I had some empathy for the lesbian separatists, even though they were, treating me with contempt in the class. But in that class, I learned a lot about French psychoanalytic criticism, like Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray, and there are several others, Hélène Cixous. I read about lots of different approaches to feminism, and central to a lot of it is just the role that mothering plays in what women are able to do, what choices women are able to make with their lives, and what society will allow women to do. If you choose to be a mother in society, that to many groups it defines you. You're no longer defined by who you were before you became a mother. Now you're someone's mother, and so you're positioned in relation to somebody else rather than in relation to who you view yourself as being, as an individual. So that was number 3. And then number 4, I told you it was a long story. It was needing a scholarly research agenda. After I decided to start looking for tenure track jobs teaching in universities, and started looking at the job ads, I was applying for creative writing positions because I was a creative writer. My PhD dissertation was a young adult novel called Ash, and it was published in 1996. And I published, by the time I started doing the job hunt in 2002, I had published quite a few books and stories and essays and things like that. I'd done some scholarship. I was always interested in scholarship. I went to the Children's Literature Association convention every year and always wrote 1 paper. So basically what I would do is write 1 scholarly paper a year and spend the rest of my time writing fiction, mostly. But when it came time for the job search, I applied for 6 creative writing positions and 6 children's literature positions. I got 0 interviews on the creative writing positions and 6 interviews on the children's literature positions, because there's no such thing as a children's writer in the academy for a tenure track position. Well, there are a couple of them in the world now, but at the time that I was applying, children's literature was not viewed as real creative writing. They're looking for people like Dr. Donaghy and Dr. Taracchio that write grown-up stuff. Those are the people they're interviewing, giving jobs in creative writing. But I was already known in children's literature circles, and I could hold my own as a scholar, but in order to get a job, I was going to have to bump up my scholarly game in order to be recognized as truly authentic and, a scholar in the field. And I knew this, so before I went on my interviews, I prepared myself to think about, all right, well, what will my scholarly agenda be when I start teaching at a university? And I thought automatically, well, that's it. I've been thinking about this mother stuff for years now. I've felt it viscerally in my own life. I have studied feminist theory and thought about it at the graduate level. I have, I forgot my other one. Oh, the creative writing stuff. I've been thinking about it from the perspective how the writers are approaching it. What is going on here? I want to find out what's going on here, and that's going to be my scholarly agenda. So when I got to Eastern and I had my interview here, and one of the questions they asked me in my meeting with the search committee was, we have the senior seminar here at Eastern, this 2-semester sequence, 461 and 462. Everyone has a chance to teach it. What would you teach yours on? And I said, well, I think I would teach it on mothers in children's and young adult literature. And indeed, I found myself doing that the next year. So that leads me to the next part of the answer to that question. And the next experience that sparked my interest to write about the topic of mothers and children's and young adult literature was teaching the senior seminar for the first time in 2003 here at Eastern. And then I taught it as a special topics class at Hollins at the graduate level in 2005. It became a regular course, and I started working on it in conference papers around that time. And I started delivering those back in 2004. My first conference paper was called Mass Market Mommy, Children's Picture Books as Mother Training Manuals. And that was delivered in Fresno in 2004. And so in that paper, I talked about these books that I held up at the beginning and some other books about how they position the mother as this all-consuming, all-loving, self-sacrificing person who builds her life around her child. And in these books, it's a son. You don't see fathers around. You don't see the mother working. You just see this bond that is how it defines her. The next one that I did in 2005 was called Performing Motherhood, Not Rejection of the Maternal and Award-Winning Novels for Young People. That was given in Winnipeg in 2005. That's the chapter, that's the paper that eventually led to the chapter that I contributed to the mother's book called Abandoning Mothers. It was called Performing Motherhood, Not because the theme of the conference at that time was performance, well, it was Judith Butler, really, performing gender and that sort of thing. Another one, the first one that I got published on my mothering work was called The Berenstain Bears and the Reproduction of Mothering. That I delivered in 2006, and it was published in The Lion and the Unicorn, which is a scholarly journal, in 2007. And that talks about Nancy Chodorov's theory of how traditional mothering is reproduced from one generation to the next through family practices, but the culture, and also through psychology. She's one of the psychoanalytic critics who has followed from Freud and adapted Freud's ideas more to mothering stuff, and sort of Lacanian in a way. Some of you might have studied Lacan and the mirror phase and how children identify with the mother early on and then have to learn to separate from the mother, learn that they are other than the mother. And I won't go through all of my papers that I've done, but the next shift that came in my mother work was looking at gender ideology in Disney. And I did a bunch of papers on Disney and published some things and even got to do some talks around the world. I was invited to do a talk in Taiwan, and I was invited to do a talk in London on the Disney subject, which was really fun. And then I finally published my Disney work, kind of compressed it down to one article about mothering. It's called Nearly Everybody Gets Twitter-pated. Twitter-pated comes from Bambi, when the owl says to Bambi and his friends, nearly everybody gets Twitter-pated in the springtime. And it's talking about when the male characters are walking along and they bump into a pretty female character who bats her eyes, and they're in love and they're done. Yeah. So anyway, it's called Nearly Everybody Gets Twitter-pated, the Disney version of mothering. And that was published in Children's Literature and Education last March 2015. So this leads me to the next question that I was asked. Can you think of anything you wish could have made it into this collection? In other words, are there any omissions that you regret? The reason that the Children's Literature and Education Journal leads me to this question is that, yes, we would have regretted not being able to publish a bunch of the proposals that we received. We received well over 80 proposals by the time our call for paper was finished. It was an overwhelming response, a very high quality response too. So we weren't able to use all of the really good proposals that we got. But we did pitch an idea to the Children's Literature and Education Journal to edit a special issue on performing motherhood for them. And they swept it right up and they said, yes, that's a great idea. So we were able to use 6 of the proposals to develop into articles for that scholarly journal. And so we were able to publish 19 of the proposals that we received. Some authors that were actually originally accepted into the book were unable to complete their articles for one reason or another. And I was extremely disappointed that 2 of those were diverse voices. One was an African-American scholar in the US, absolutely brilliant, great idea. She wasn't able to get her article finished partly because she was sort of crossing disciplines, and she was targeting more toward an education audience and not toward the audience that we were developing with English studies. And so she just got a little frustrated with our revision requests and we withdrew her manuscript. And then the other one was a Korean American critic who was going to talk about the diaspora mothers, Korean diaspora mothers. And I think it would have been just a beautiful essay, but she just got too busy to get the writing done. The way it works is you send out a call for papers, a call for proposals. They send you an abstract. Based on the abstract, you tentatively select what you want to put in the book. You put them all together, write up a book proposal that you send to the press, and they either reject it, suggest that you revise it and resubmit, or accept it. Ours was accepted. It was unanimous from the voting committee, and they accepted it. And so we got to town and asked the contributors to write the draft of the first draft of their chapter contributions. We sent them comments back on those, and they turned them around in a few months. And then we sent them comments back on those and turned those around in a few months. And then we had a whole book to send into the press. And at that point, they sent it out to an external reviewer who gave us further feedback for revisions on the book. And so that's how it was made. I want to say there were a couple other regrets that I had. One was that we had no male critics represented in the book. We did receive a very small number of submissions from men. Unfortunately, they were just very weak. No, Raouf, come on. Not all men are weak. But the particular proposals that we received for the collection did not show a thorough understanding of the research that had done, the little bit of research that had been done before, or didn't bring a theoretical lens in that worked based on our experience of reading the criticism. But I would have loved to have had a strong proposal from a man, and I feel like it's something missing from the collection. And finally, and this is my biggest regret personally, is that we don't have a chapter about lesbian mothers in children's lit. And I think it's a really important area that I wish somebody had submitted a proposal. And I even reached out and invited a couple people that I know who might have been able to contribute a good chapter, but they were too busy and couldn't pursue it, or it wasn't directly in their research interest or agenda at that time, so we didn't have that in the book. But I think I can turn this into lemonade and say that there's still a lot of room to do more work in mothers and children's and young adult literature. Our intention with this book is to open a conversation that will go on and hopefully inspire others to pick up some of this work and develop it and make it stronger and make more of it. My next question. What other groups do you feel are underrepresented in literary theory and research? That's a really interesting question. I think I have to qualify it a bit and how I'm going to answer it. I'm going to talk about how it relates to children's literature and young adult literature, and I'm going to bring it back a bit to the primary text, not just to theory and research, because I think theory and research about what? What are you looking at? You can't create something out of nothing, right? So you have to have the text there to look at. And I think that probably the biggest underrepresentation in children's and young adult literature is of international voices. And that's because of the way the publishing world works. The United States and the UK completely dominate publishing in English, and they are an export rather than import country for the most part. We do have some literature and translation, but it's usually just maybe the award-winning texts from an author that's been recognized, like with the Hans Christian Andersen Award or something like that. We do not have a lot of international voices being translated into English, and I think that it's a big gap. It's very underrepresented. If we had that, then more theories and research would come up in those areas. We do import some theories, of course, from abroad. I mentioned before the French psychoanalytic critics, and you've probably heard of Bakhtin, and you've probably heard of a bunch of Western thinkers, and maybe even some Eastern thinkers that we apply to our readings. But we need more primary books that are international. Same goes for minorities. That is getting better. Minorities within the US I'm talking about. There was a horrible paucity of minority written literature in the past. It's still very much underrepresented if you look at the proportion of the population, but there's a lot of attention on it now, and there's a lot of, I think, sincere dedication and effort being given to publishing more voices and getting them out there and getting more criticism done, good quality research done. So that's getting better, but it's in weakness. But now I'm coming to the one that matters most to me, the thing that I'm working on now, and that is the underrepresentation of literary theory and research in the areas of animals in children's lit. Particularly anthropomorphism is my interest. That, in case you aren't familiar with it, is representing animals or toys or anything that's non-human as acting like humans. So anytime you see an animal talking, dressing in human clothes, living in a human house, you know that's anthropomorphism. But anthropomorphism can also be a lot more subtle. One of the things I write about in my Twitter-pated essay about Disney mothering, for instance, is that in the True Life Adventures documentary series that Disney produced in the 30s to the 60s, they presented them as nature, but they scripted the characters and made them act like humans. They anthropomorphized them in ways that are a lot less easy to see than they are if you have, Mama Berenstain wearing an apron and sweeping out the house. Hopefully next year I'll be able to work on my anthropomorphism project. I've applied for a sabbatical for next year, and my goal is to write a chapter, an essay, and to finish a novel that I've been working on, an animal fantasy, where there's a colony of frogs that used to be human, and I'm not going to tell you any more than that. I don't want to jinx it. How are we doing on time, Dr. Spicer?
Oh, you're good. It's only 2:30.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Here's another question. Do you see any trends emerging in the way that mothers are presented in literature? Can you make any predictions about the future of mothers and maternal figures in literature? Well, I'm really hoping that our book will bring attention to the mother figure as an individual, not defined solely by her relationship to her children or to her husband or to her significant other, and not always seen from the child's needs and the child's developmental perspective, which is immature. It's supposed to be. Children are egocentric. That's not an insult. But if a mother is defined solely from that, it really diminishes her, right? I think that children's literature and critics need to find a way to give a full vision of the mother herself. And I think that we are heading in that direction. There's a lot of hope because we are heading for our first woman president who is a mom and a grandma, and everyone can see that she's been very successful at that, and it hasn't held her back from being a successful lawyer, from being the Secretary of State, from being a senator, and now she's going to be a president. And I think I can only begin to imagine the changes that that's going to make in how mothers are represented in children's literature. I think it's going to open up a lot of possibility that wasn't really obvious before. And the same thing, a question I have here, how do you think the critical study of literary motherhood is going to develop over the next decade or so? So those two questions are going to go hand in hand. When the primary texts are there, the criticism is going to be there. If the criticism is calling for the primary text to be there, maybe someone will answer that call and we'll get it. I do want to share with you some things that are going on in motherhood studies, not showing up so much in children's lit yet, but there's a scholar named Andrea Riley out of Canada who has a press and a journal that focuses primarily on, well, entirely actually, on mothering issues in society. And so I'm going to read you a paragraph out of the book that talks about some recent studies that have appeared that focus on mothering experiences that challenge white middle-class stereotypes of the nuclear two-parent biological family, including ethnographic studies of teen mothers. We cite a lot of sources here, but I'm going to skip over them. Working class and poor mothers, adoptive mothers, lesbian mothers. Challenges to hegemonic views of mothering have also come from increased attention to globalization. Barbara Eckenrock and Arlie Russell Hochschild refer, for instance, to a care drain as women from poor countries are solicited to provide childcare for working mothers in rich countries, often leaving their own children behind. This transnational caregiving labor is one of a number of factors considered by the contributors in Wendy Shavkin and Jane Marie Myers' The Globalization of Motherhood, Deconstructions and Reconstructions of Biology and Care, which looks at issues such as declining fertility rates, increasing female employment, the ability and expense of reproductive technologies, and changing family structures, all of which explode traditional myths of motherhood in Western culture. And it goes on, but so I think that the way has been paved for literary critics to apply these approaches from outside of literature to a study of literature that are in a multidisciplinary way, and I think that will happen. I hope it will happen. Question: did the research you did for this collection change your theory or thesis at all? If so, what did you expect to find or prove? Well, the answer to that is both yes and no. Did it change my thesis in my Abandoning Mothers chapter? No. I did revise it quite a bit to improve my arguments and to give stronger evidence and that sort of thing, but my thesis remained the same. I think it was solid when I started. But my mind was definitely changed. My view of theories and research about mothering changed a lot by the process of working with all the different authors who were bringing different lenses to their subjects. I learned so much from these people that I worked with. I learned the most, I think, about the areas of cognitive studies and reading schemas, which kind of is a linguistic approach and kind of is a psychology approach. It's a kind of melded field. Karen knows a lot about that area, and when we received quite a few essays that talked about these things. Some of them went into the journal and some of them went into the book. It's kind of complicated. It's a little bit related to what Dr. Tapia does here. Those of you who know her, her idea of conceptual metaphor. Did anybody ever study conceptual metaphor with Dr. Tapia? She's our linguist in the department. Conceptual metaphor is what cognitive linguists describe as the way that our mind equates two different things that have something that's alike and something that's different, and it's how we learn. So, for instance, the conceptual metaphor of Mother Earth. That's the Earth is our mother, the mother who provides for us, gives birth to us, but the Earth is where we live. So one of the chapters, I can't remember if it was a chapter or an article, talks about the schema of the Earth Mother in a novel by Terry Pratchett. It took me a little while to wrap my brain around it, but once I got it, I thought it was really brilliant to show how when young children are learning to understand the world through language, they associate one thing with another thing. It's how they build knowledge. It's like building a house from the bottom up. But sometimes when you're equating one thing with another thing, you get a kind of jumble because you start associating the other thing that's not like it too with the first thing. And then you can end up with some mistaken thinking. But I don't want to get off track with that too much. It's kind of complex. Here's a question. Who's your favorite literary mother or maternal figure? And I saw that and I said, well, sheesh, that's like asking who my favorite child is of my own or my favorite children's book. No way I can answer that. But one thing I can do is I can trace it back to, I think, the literary foremother of feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. Some of you may know that Mary Wollstonecraft was the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft died within 2 weeks after Mary Shelley was born. Mary Wollstonecraft had an infection in the uterus because her placenta didn't all come out after the labor. And so she literally died from the childbirth. And I think that is a kind of poignant metaphor for a literary foremother or a critical foremother. You know, here's somebody that gave birth to a feminist movement, but also and gave birth to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein about the approach of science and the monsters you can make. For one text that I really like, children's book that I really like, that is a good model of mothering, if I can find it. I thought I brought it with me. I guess I don't have it with me. I'm going to look in my bag and see if it's still in there. No, I didn't bring it. All right. It's Mama, Do You Love Me by Barbara LaValle and Barbara Juice. It's about an Inuit mother and daughter. And what I love about this story, I wish I could read it to you, I have it back on my desk, I guess, is that the child keeps pushing her mother's buttons. Mama, would you love me if I do this? Mama, would you love me if I do that? And she escalates in the naughtiness or the shocking nature of what she's asking her mother. And her mother always says, I love you, but she's very honest. You know, her ambivalence of motherhood comes across because, you know, when she says, well, I would be angry with you if you did that, but I'll still love you. Or I think the child at once says, what if I turned into a bear and came in and bared my claws to you or something like that? And the mother said, well, I would be very frightened and I would still love you. And so it's a story that doesn't have all this sentimentality, love you forever, like you for always, as long as my living driving across the town with a ladder up to your room. You know, it shows that mothers have a range of emotion and that they can be angry, which we should be allowed to be angry. We're doing all right, I think. How do you juggle your critical and creative work? How do you approach writing a scholarly article versus writing a young adult novel? I could write a whole book about that question, actually. I have to say, since I became department chair, creative writing has been hard for me. I haven't been able to hold a world in my brain to write a novel during the school year at all. I've been working on I call it my Froggy book, during the summers when I can, but it takes a long time to build a world, to get your head into that world. And it's hard to jerk yourself out of it to focus on something else. And when you're department chair, you have so many interruptions. Dr. McNeil can tell you, he's up there and he was chair and he knows all about this. You're working on one thing and by the end of the day, there it is still on your computer, buried under many of the other things that came in and all the people that came to your door and needed you. Right, Miranda? Yeah. Can you sign this one? Yeah. But on the bright side of that, I was able to do more scholarship than I normally would have if I was working on novels, because I can compartmentalize those a little better. I can take it in bits and pieces and pull them together when I had time. I could read an article and take notes on it and then return to the notes later, even if I forgot the article, or I could take some more notes on a primary text, and during the winter break, I could pull together the draft of a paper. I could, when I was editing the essays, I could edit an essay a day and get back to the author. So I found that to be very satisfying. It made me feel good that, you know, I wasn't just doing nothing except being chair. I was very productive, actually. I won an essay award and got a book published that I had not had time to do for 10 years until Karen said to me, she visited my class. I think it was 2013, she visited my class. She said, when are you going to do this book anyway? Everybody's been going to your papers at the conferences for years and waiting for your book. And I said, well, someday I'll do it. And she said, well, what if you had help? I said, are you offering? And she said, well, if you'll take the offer, I'll help. And I said, okay. And here we have the book. That's how it happened. As far as the approach to them, how are they similar and how are they different? There are definitely similarities in both. I am a thorough researcher in both, for instance. I mean, I even want to get, if I'm writing a setting that isn't my backyard that I know intimately, I want to get the right plants growing at the right time of the year. I want to get the weather patterns right. I think it's so important to developing a world that your readers will believe, to get sensory details right. So you can't make them up. You got to find them out. In the case of my animal world, I am doing thorough research on animal behavior in the environments where my animals are set, so that when my anthropomorphized frogs, the reason that they're anthropomorphized is they really were humans before. That's why they think like humans. They have a human brain, so they're allowed. But I want to also find out how real frogs behave and what we know, what science knows about them, so that I can represent them as accurately as I possibly can, to keep a relationship with the natural world instead of a speciesist relationship which humans have. You know, we're anthropocentric. We're all about ourselves. Everything else is here in relation to ourselves. I don't want to do that in my work. So research is really vitally important to creative work as much as it is to scholarly work. Both of them, for me, intersect with my teaching, and that's a big help. Some of you have been in my classes, you know that I'm often sharing with you materials that I'm working on myself. It helps me think more deeply about it to get your ideas too, and it also is more efficient use of my time, because then the research that I do in preparation to teach your class, I can also use in my own work when I'm either writing a creative piece or writing an article. So I try to intersect my teaching with my writing interests wherever I can. Of course, try not to do it at your expense if possible. But both involve a lot of pre-writing and planning in order to do it successfully. It takes a lot of time to do a good article. As you can see from what I've told you so far, this Mother's Book really is the product of over 10 years of thinking and writing and working and slowly slogging away at the papers and the chapters. Differences. I already talked about one, the world building thing. The world of a novel, for me, populates my whole mind. I think about it all the time when I'm writing one. It's hard to think about other stuff. I don't want to pull myself away from it to do other stuff. Scholarship isn't like that. Scholarship is more like, oh, I've got laundry to do. I can't write right now. I gotta go mop that floor. Oh my goodness, look at the spots on those windows. I've got to get the squeegee out. Yeah, I don't do that when I'm writing a novel. You know, the house is a wreck when I'm writing a novel. Fiction is more thematic, and I find it more complex to get it right. I tend to go through a lot of drafts. When I write a novel, I have to write it all the way through once before I even know what it is. And then I'm gonna go turn it away, put it in a closet, start up a new file, and start writing again. Scholarship isn't that way for me. I do revision, don't get me wrong, I do deep revision with my scholarship, but the kind of revision I do there is more along the lines of, oh gee, I think I need to expand that argument a little bit more, I gotta go back and read some more of Lakoff and Johnson, or boy, I don't like the organization of this one bit. Let me see if there's another way that I can get my way into this argument and set it up for the reader to follow through. So those two are very different approaches, I think. All right, I'm going to spend a couple minutes answering some questions you had about specific details in the book now. This is a question that refers to page 3. You refer to the concept of mothers being relegated to background noise, but because of this, could we almost see mothers as unsung heroes where they can still do great things? Well, I can say sure, but what hero wants to be unsung? Let's take a closer look at the passage where that phrase comes from on page 3, and I can explain a little more. That's page 4. Okay. I'm going to read the whole paragraph here. Her, meaning the mother, guises in the literature written for children often seem almost cartoonish given the complexity of her position within a child's actual life. The discursive mother is often static, if not flat, as authors enact a sort of pedagogy or wish for both adult and child readers regarding how an ideal mother should or should not act, revealing through plot and character arcs the consequences of her brand of nurturance. Often she's relegated to background noise as the focus understandably shifts from to the development of the child character, but her influence remains significant and worthy of close consideration. So the relegated to background noise, I think, partially refers to a convention in children's literature called "get the parents out of the way." Some of you have heard this, I think. It's a kind of truism in books about writing for children that the focus should be on the children developing, solving their own problems, getting into conflicts, getting out of conflicts without the intervention of their parents. And since traditionally it was more often that the mother would be around to do that, the mother was viewed as this protective figure, this nurturing figure. So she's got to go into the background so that the focus can remain on the child, even though in real life that doesn't usually happen in, the typical nuclear family. And I don't mean to stereotype or say that, children are never left alone and they're never neglected. We know this does happen. But we're talking about how children's literature will just kind of shove the mother off into the background and focus on the kids, and that's part of how the genre works. But because the genre works that way, it creates an emphasis on this background as mother that isn't really quite fair to the mother, right? And how children shape their views of mothers through reading a lot of children's literature that does this. It's kind of like a cognitive dissonance in a way. On page 8, you stated that the mother is the first other to meet with their child, and as a result, she holds more control. To what extent do you believe that mother has control over her child in contrast to her significant other? Well, that's another good question, and again, I want to look at the context of that statement a little bit with you. The previous sentence to where that quotation happens is, specifically, Freud posited that the quality of a child's relationship to his or her biological mother was a defining developmental factor. The mother is the first other that a child encounters, and thus she's extremely powerful. She quite literally holds the power of life and death over the child, so she is experienced psychically not only as the firmest existential support, but also a potential existential threat. And we go on to problematize Freud, by the way, and a lot of feminist theorists have. As an example, though, I just want to read you the beginning of a book that you all know, Where the Wild Things Are. Story and pictures by the dearly beloved, belated Maurice Sendak. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind or another, his mother called him "wild thing," and Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. Need I say more? The power of the mother, right? The control of the mother. It's, if the mother was staying at home with the child and the child was acting out, she had to socialize the child, right? So the child learns social order, discipline, rules through the power of the mother, who at that time is much bigger, can actually pick the kid up under the arm, haul him into the bed, which I did many a time. And so, as Dorothy Dinnerstein talks about in her 1976 book, The Mermaid and the Minotaur, or The Rocking of the Cradle and the Ruling of the World, she argues that sexism and aggression are both inevitable consequences of child rearing being left exclusively to women. I think if you read Where the Wild Things Are, and then maybe you pair that with some, go talk to Dr. Claremont-Ferrand about some of the queen mother, king son relationships in history, about how in order to have any power in the world, the woman had to pull the strings of her son. this starts to make a little more sense. It might be harder for those of you who grew up after the second wave of feminism to see this, but it's still out there in the world now. If you look at the opposition to Hillary Clinton and the way people talk about her, right? That nasty woman, it's still with us. It's always been possible that someone besides the mother could be the first other, right? It's possible. Certainly there's always been adoption. Mothers have died during childbirth. Mary Wollstonecraft did. I don't know who Mary Shelley's first other was, but I'm going to guess it wasn't William Godwin. It was probably another woman in the family who picked up the responsibility, the domestic responsibility of childbearing. I do think that this will change. It's very hopeful with gay marriage moving forward now. Some of my best friends, gay males, adopted a child and they're raising him, and he's an awesome kid and they're an awesome family. And as the culture comes to accept rather than criticize and view it as aberrant, I think that this othering will change. And again, Hillary Clinton, you know. I hope it's going to change, because I think that as long as child rearing is considered more a mothering role than a fathering role, equality is going to have a hard time happening. It's just physically difficult to do it all and be it all without egalitarian parenting and without equal access to the workplace. You know, when the fathers are staying home with the baby as much as the mothers are staying home with the baby when it's born, then I think we'll see the other caregiver being viewed as the first other more often than the mother, or as often as the mother. On page 11, it's written that sources that lie outside of academic studies tend to host the best conversations. Is there something exclusive that these creative writers and blog columnists have access to, or in this case, have better chances with? I think that is a very interesting and complex question. I don't know the answer to it, but I can speculate about a few things. One of them I sort of alluded to before, which is that children's writers are not viewed as having the intellectual bona fides in the academy and stuff. And in a way, there's a sort of freedom behind that for writers and bloggers, because they're not entering into the academic discourse. They can say what they think, and they don't have to worry about getting tenure. They don't have to worry about impressing the promotion and tenure committee with how brilliant their research is. Work on mothers, work on the domestic sphere is not viewed as serious or important, as looking at the canon, the literary canon, for instance, traditionally in English, or certainly, the STEM disciplines or things like that. So I think that's a part of it. When the Children's Literature Association began, that's the scholarly group that studies children's literature from an academic viewpoint. That's the place that gave me the award for the Anthropomorphism in Picture Book article. Their first subtitle of their first conference and their first journal was Children's Literature, The Great Excluded. And their initial focus when they started back in the 80s was, hey, look, nobody is taking serious scholarly, giving serious scholarly attention to children's literature in higher ed. If there is a children's lit course, it's in the education department and it's viewed as pedagogy and didactic. You're learning how to use the literature with kids. You're not really looking at its literary qualities. You're not really looking at what it contributes to culture and society, how it builds ideas, how it is intertextual with other literature, that it's part of all literature. It's got this division between children and adults and things like this. So at the very beginning, children's literature scholarship, as well as creative writing, had to prove itself to the academy. Skip ahead to now, and yes, well, we have we have a powerhouse, right? Dr. Spicer and me, yeah, baby, at Eastern. But there are still universities that don't have scholars of children's literature in the English department, which that's just, why? Why do you not view it? I think, honestly, children's literature has a huger impact on our culture today than Shakespeare. And I would not say don't study Shakespeare, Shakespeare rocks, but everybody reads this. Wouldn't it be better to know what this is teaching us and getting into our brains before we are reflective and analytical and even know what ideology is and worldviews and beliefs are? Those run the world. So we've gotten that message across more than it used to be, for sure. The other thing I think that the mommy bloggers and the authors can do is, it's their life. They're living it. So they can have these conversations because they're smart too. You don't need to have a PhD to be smart and have a good intellectual conversation. I mean, it doesn't hurt you, but, well, maybe it does hurt some people. But I think that's part of it, And just in general, adult themes are always valued more than child themes. Anyone who studies childhood and how the world views children are viewed as inferior. They're beneath adults. And you can even see this blended with how the patriarchal culture works or the structure works. If you look at who is teaching whom in the school system, the younger the child is, the more likely that it's women teaching them. The older the child is, the more sophisticated, so say, look, grad school, the more likely that it's a male teaching. And there's a spectrum that goes along. And that's no mistake. There's something to that. So I think that probably it's been hard to have conversations about mothering in the academy because mothers are in a difficult place in the academy. Mothers have to prove their seriousness to promotion and tenure committees. They have to show that they can work just as hard as people who are not mothers. They have to not suggest that they're letting their colleagues pick up the slack so that they can go and pick up their kids from school, things like that. So those are my speculations about the answer to that question. Are we supposed to end at 3?
I think we have to wait until 3:30. Was Miranda up there at 3:30?
Dr. McNeil, when is our committee meeting? 15 minutes. Okay. I'll very quickly run through the last 2 then. How has the role of an abandoned mother shaped literature since the 1970s? This is the heart of my own chapter that I contributed to the collection called Abandoning Mothers. And in that chapter, I won't do a reading from it because we don't have time, but I do look at some major award-winning novels that are about a child whose mother abandons the family. One of them is The Great Gilly Hopkins by Catherine Patterson, which is a really amazing, amazing book. It's about a foster child who goes to the home of Mamie Trotter. She's a nasty little girl, but she's brilliant. She's a racist, she's a sexist, she's every kind of issue you can think of. She's got a potty mouth. But you develop empathy with her immediately because her mother abandoned her, right? But she has this kind of, the reader can see unrealistic and wrong expectation that her mother's going to come get her, or that her mother is the one person that can make her life good. So I analyze that book. I look at Dicey's Song by Cynthia Voigt, which got the Newbery in, I want to say 79, something like that. And this mother abandons the children in the first book of a series of 7 Tillerman books. She abandons them in a parking lot of a mall, and the kids, led by the oldest one, Dicey, walk like 2 or 3 states away to find their grandmother and go live with her. And then eventually the mother dies. And so she abandons them through the only socially acceptable way, through death. you're okay. It's okay. It's not okay, but the mother doesn't get punished for dying and abandoning her children. She gets punished in literature for leaving her children for whatever the reason is. And whatever the reason is never, I will tell you, almost rarely. It's getting better. There are a couple better ones now, but it's very rare that the mother will be shown in her own skin and given a chance to speak for herself. She's represented through those who judge her, and the reader is positioned always to feel with the child, the need of the child, the longing of the child, and feel that the child is entitled to that ideal mother that nobody ever had. That's one of the things I talk about. But the theoretical approach that I use in my chapter is Susan Faludi's Backlash. It's a book published in the 90s, 80s, 90s, I forget now what year. She talks about how whenever there's a movement forward in the feminist movement, that the culture brings a backlash through film, television, fashion, basically every avenue of culture. We get stories like, for instance, Kramer versus Kramer, that movie from the 70s, I think you might know about that, where the mother leaves and the father, Dustin Hoffman, takes care of their kid. But in the end, when she comes back, she gets the kid, and you hate her, and you think Dustin Hoffman should have the kid. She looks at lots of things like that to show how when women make a step forward in politics or in family rights or laws, that the culture comes back and tries to push her back. But it's like a corkscrew growth, Susan Faludi says. A corkscrew, it's slow progress. It goes in a spiral, but it doesn't go backwards. It does keep going ahead, but it's just very slow. And that's what the backlash is. And then one last quick question that you had for me. On page 230, you mentioned the conflict felt by the mother author. Can you spend some time discussing this concept and the role it plays in your work? So the context of that question was I've been talking about how Alice Walker, the Pulitzer Prize winning writer, you might know her work, Color Purple, etc. Her daughter, Rebecca Walker, had a very public calling out. Rebecca Walker accused Alice Walker of being a horrible mother and blamed capital F feminism, and it was just a very nasty, terrible thing. And I analyze that somewhat in the book, but I come back to it in the end, and I say, where do I say? Where do I want to go? Well, I won't be able to bring in the Walkers, I guess I don't have time. But largely subconscious perceptions can show themselves in creative writing, is what I say. Thus, separation and guilt often emerge as the axis of conflict for contemporary women writers, claims Jessica Benjamin. Jessica Benjamin is a psychoanalytic critic who has done a lot of work on mothering. The conflict felt by the mother author, the mother editor, the mother critic, is projected into award-winning children's fiction about mothers who leave and becomes part of the backlash that serves to perpetuate the conflict itself. Although Jacqueline Rose has argued, how about that? We're reading Jacqueline Rose this week in 203. Although Jacqueline Rose has argued the impossibility of representing a child's viewpoint in fiction written by adults, the use of a child's focalizing perspective defines the genre. Perhaps that makes representing mothers in children's fiction a double impossibility, abandoning mothers, indeed. So my personal thing about that is I felt that mother-author conflict very viscerally when my kids were young. I absolutely loved, you can probably pick up on that, writing. I adore my children, love my children with a passion, love being a mother, also adored my characters, and wanted to sink myself into writing. My children and their father at that time felt that any attention that I gave my writing was taken away from them. They felt it was like they were entitled to it, the writing was not. And I felt that a lot. In fact, I'm no longer married to that man. They wanted all of me. And I think, that it wasn't them individually. It was a cultural construction of that giving tree mother, the love you forever mother, the runaway bunny mother. That's the figure that people feel entitled to. That mother who has no life other than her child, to the point where after he grows up and he's going to go across with a ladder. I already told you that one. So I was positioned, not just by my family, because I think that they were pawns in this game too. You know, it's not like they did this on purpose. But I was positioned to feel like a selfish and bad mother because I would not sacrifice my writing career. Even when I went to get my PhD, I got a lot of fights. I tried very hard to meet my family's needs. And those of you who have been my students, you know how I am. Well, I'm like that with my family too. Then I'll go to you. I tried very hard to meet my family's needs and mine both. So I identified with Alice Walker when I read about her situation with her daughter. If I had time, I would have read a quote from her where she says she knows that she's a good enough mother. And good enough mother is an idea by the child psychologist D.W. Winnicott. He talked about how you need to be a good enough mother for your child to individuate from you. You don't need to be the ideal mother. And I know that I'm a good enough mother, same as I'm a good enough teacher and a good enough department chair. But it's really not easy standing up to the backlash to feminism in the popular culture. And it's even hard to stand up to it with the people that you love the most. But once I gained the confidence in my understanding of the gender ideology from that feminist theory class and other things that abandons mothers, then there was no turning back for me. I continued to love both of my children and my writing with a stubborn passion, and now through my scholarly criticism, I'm standing up for giving mothers agency in children's and young adult literature too.